Okay, so here's what I want to do. Now I kind of want to, Tom McGowan, and again, if you should share the link if you haven't. I want to hit these bullet points
I'll do
that
that.
he gives in his lectures because it's the clearest and most straightforward way of talking about this stuff. And here I want to show the kind of historical development this concept has had. And then, because we're going to go from Freud on death drive to Lacan on death drive to Zizek on death drive. And then there's some other examples at the end I would like to discuss. So I think the stuff at the end is actually going to be some of the more some of the stuff that's more fun to discuss. So I want to get through this as quickly as we can. I don't want to rush, but I'm saying I want to have us. I want us for us to have enough time to discuss these points at the end of this lecture. So
Cool. We've got 30 people with us right now. Holy.
awesome. Okay, so again, I owe this entirely to Todd McGowan's excellent lecture, and again, I was going to try to put together my own bullet points, but I'm like, screw it. He nailed it. So let's just hit these bullet points. So again, death drive has to do with this impulse in us where we don't act for our pleasure. We don't act for our own good. Death drive has to do with our actions that undermine ourselves, undermine others, undermine our society, undermine our stability. And so death drive is a kind of destruction for the sake of destruction, self-destruction, societal destruction. And that sounds bad, but as we start to flesh this out, we start to see that that actually can be great too. It depends on the context and the situation. So death drive, this concept is first developed by Freud in his Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which was released in 1920, and it caused this radical shift in the history of psychoanalysis. We could even think that there's before Beyond the Pleasure Principle and after Beyond the Pleasure Principle. It was that much of a paradigm shift because, again, up until this point, Freud had only thought in terms of pleasure or displeasure, and by displeasure I mean pain, like actual pain that we would just avoid at all costs. And it's in this book that he starts to discover something else is going on with us, and that is death drive. And so he discovers death drive by focusing on certain clinical experiences he has with his patients. He sees in his patients that they do certain things that make absolutely no sense when viewed from the perspective of the pleasure principle. He's going, okay, these actions, these behaviors do not produce pleasure. They produce the opposite. And yet what's bizarre about it is that it's not like they're doing this by accident. It's like they're repeating these things over and over again as if they enjoy these actions. And yet these actions are not pleasurable. They produce an overabundance of stimulation or excitation, and yet they seem enjoyable. And so that's where he starts to get this concept. And one of the big examples is his patients would often repeat or relive certain traumatic experiences, which cause them a great deal of suffering. But this cannot be accounted for by appealing to the pleasure principle. So, of course, the famous example from this book is the war neuroses, or we call it PTSD. Back then they called it shell shock, where the guys who were in World War I witnessed and lived through absolutely horrible traumatic experiences, and yet at night, dreaming all this, they would constantly go back there. They'd constantly repeat this, and this kind of repeating experiences that are painful or displeasurable seems to contradict the pleasure principle, right? Because you're constantly, you as an ego, right? You don't have control of this, but you as a psyche, right? Your unconscious is constantly making you relive things that, from the perspective of pleasure or comfort or stability, you don't want to relive. And so he sees this form of repetition as like this leads him to formulate the death drive. And there's also the example of negative therapeutic reaction, which is somebody's been in psychoanalysis for many years. They've made a lot of progress. They've gotten certain problems under control. And then right as they can feel like they're approaching the end of the analysis, they totally fucking regress. They totally undermine all of the progress they've made. And it's like it's like, oh, we got to start analysis all over again. And so these two examples really bothered Freud, and he couldn't make sense of them within his conceptual framework of the time. And he was like, okay, these don't fit within my framework. I've got to rethink my basic framework. And so the search for an explanation of these clinical phenomena leads him to discover the death drive. So whereas the pleasure principle eliminates or evacuates excitation from the psyche, death drive produces and intensifies this excitation. The most basic way death drive builds excitation is through repetition, especially repetition compulsion. And it's like even in just like in a bodily movement, like if you like move your arm the same way over and over and over again, it like builds up excitation in your arm. And yeah, at some point, obviously you stop, but he's saying like you can see how repetition actually builds excitation in the body and in the psyche. Somehow like it's the motor of intensification. So he links death drive to repetition, but then he kind of drops it in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. But Lacan and Zizek, they'll often link jouissance and death drive to repetition, but we'll get there in a minute.
So
go ahead.
Really quick, I think Dr. McGowan had said, like, I think right at the beginning of that lecture, if I remember right, it kind of gave a definition of death drive that I wanted to write on the board, but I wanted to make sure I had it right before I wrote it down.
Okay.
I think it was doing something not for pleasure or your own well-being, or against your own well-being.
I mean, yeah, I'm not exactly sure that's verbatim, but that's his point. Yeah, it's okay. Where death drive is doing something in a way that's self-sabotaging, that goes against your self-interest, goes against your well-being. No, and so this is one of the things that Lacan and Zizek will reject about Freud's concept of the death drive. So Freud argues that death drive seeks an inorganic state, which is to say actual death, or the state of not being alive, right? Being a corpse. Because to die is to basically, it's to lose the ability to even lose, right? And death drive enjoys not getting its object. Again, we haven't really fleshed that out yet.
It doesn't. That straight up doesn't make sense to me. So we do need to.
Well, we got to get down to the difference between desire and drive in a moment. But basically, it's like Zizek said earlier. Drive does not want your actual death. It wants a kind of life beyond symbolic death. Like, it wants to crash your symbolic world, your being in the world, your life world, your stability, your social self, right? Because your social self operates within the confines of law, within the confines of limitation, right? It wants to crash all that, but it doesn't mean it wants to cease to exist entirely. And so that's why Zizek says that death drive wants life, but it doesn't want our everyday lives, right? What we think of as life. It wants this life of the undead, of just the pure pursuit of enjoyment, right? And that's why he likens it to a zombie. So that's where Lacan and Zizek disagree with Freud. They would say, no, death drive does not want to literally kill us. Now, here's an important takeaway. Death drive can obviously accidentally, indirectly kill us. There's all kinds of things that we can do that's self-destructive to our health, well-being, financial security, all these kind of things, right? Gambling, right? Somebody who has a gambling addiction, right? The death drive might not be focused on actually killing the person, or think about alcoholism, right? It might not be focused on actually killing the person, but this excessive enjoyment it gets from the abuse of alcohol, or the enjoyment it gets from the abuse of gambling, can lead to your death. So even though it doesn't directly seek actual death, it can produce that inadvertently. But what it really wants is just to continue enjoying in this kind of dumb zombie-like state, beyond all social confines and social restrictions and stuff like that. Okay, no, just before we move on. So again, just for sake of clarification, Zizek and LACAN and Zizek reject Freud because they think that his concept of death drive ends up being too literal or too biological. That's not what death drive is after. It's not after biological death. It's not after our literal demise, even though it can inadvertently lead to that. So towards the end of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud really makes this bizarre assertion, and I almost think that LACAN, Zizek, McGowan, they go for this. I don't want to say that for sure, but he implies that after all of these new observations and his new reconceptualization of libidinal economy in light of the death drive, he thinks that maybe death drive is actually primary in human beings and the pleasure principle is secondary. And so the idea would be the pleasure principle actually is there just to serve death drive. Well, how would that be the case? Well, if death drive's primary drive or impulse is to build up excitation, at some point the excitation needs to be evacuated. But it's like, oh, the pleasure principle gets rid of the excitation just so death drive can build it back up. And again, this is a really radical switch in his view of libidinal economy. So death drive, another way to put this is death drive is giving yourself trouble in order to sustain excitation, right? So you think about it, say pleasure wants to achieve a certain state, attain a certain object, so as to relieve excitation, to get rid of excitation. Death drive will start putting all these hurdles in your way at an unconscious level. At a conscious level, you're not aware of it. But death drive, it's like that example I used earlier, where you're trying to finish an essay, but you keep having this impulse to go sit, watch TV, and you try to justify it to yourself, but really, it's like death drive just enjoys kind of excitation. So, if you're really stressed out, right? You're really in a rush to finish the essay. Well, if you actually finish it, you'll feel relieved and you'll calm down. So in a weird way, death drive doesn't want you to finish the essay so you can maintain this level of excitation in your body. And so a lot of the things we do, we give ourselves trouble, we put hurdles in our paths just for the sake of prolonging the path. And but it's interesting too. So Freud came to this concept of death drive very late in his career, and he uses it again in a 1929 book called Civilization and Its Discontents. And what's interesting there is he starts to link death drive to aggression, that now it takes on an even more brutal or violent conceptualization. And so, as McGowan puts it, Freud will conceptualize death drive, thanatos, as the aggression that threatens to disrupt and break apart society. He says that pleasure, or eros, is a unifying force that holds society together. In his book, Thanatos and Eros take on an almost cosmic dimension. So it's weird. It's almost like Freud flirts with a kind of cosmic dualism between Eros and Thanatos. And I'm sure that certain psychologists, certain psychoanalysts like this idea of reading these two impulses into the universe itself. But I don't think LACAN, Zizek, or McGowan would go for that. But it's worth noting that Freud, he almost gives them a cosmic significance.
Yeah, and I could totally see how. So you're saying you're not sure if they do that though? If they're
I don't think LACAN or Zizek. I think they'd say, look, these are human they're parts of who we are, but let's not read these kind of tendencies into the universe itself. On top of, I mean, in part, when you look at nature, I mean, at least animals, they don't seem to have death drive operating in them. They seem to operate according to pleasure on some level. But
I mean,
you don't.
If you were using a Deleuzian Guattarian metaphysics, though, it'd be like this is in everything. It's just territorialization, reterritorialization, you know. Right? Wouldn't they?
Yeah, but here's the whole thing. Like, the whole thing centers around states of pleasure and states of jouissance. Well, at the end of the day, there's some sort of experiencer there. And I don't think trying to write this stuff into how rocks get produced by nature, I see why they would be hesitant to go like, okay, now we're reading. It's almost, maybe they would say, here's the problem with this is these are psychoanalytic concepts we use to have a certain effectiveness in the clinic. The second we try to take these concepts outside of the clinical setting, or even outside of doing social analysis, now we're setting psychoanalysis up to be a kind of metaphysics, or like the discourse of all discourses. And that would be a move they would all reject. Okay. They wouldn't. It's like making the psychoanalysis into the other of the other, right? The meta narrative, and I think they would say, like, this is the problem that all discourses seem to have. They all want to make themselves the discourse. Science wants to do it. Religion wants to do it. And so I think they would avoid this, because the whole point for psychoanalysis, at least for Lacan, is to bring the analysan to realize there is no other of the other. There's nothing that has all the final answers. The big other doesn't exist. We talk about the big other, and of course there's, and for somebody new who's listening, by big other, we just think about the social order, think about language and our rules and customs and laws and all these kind of things, right? It's through language, it's through our societal structures that we make sense of our world and all of this, but every social order, every symbolic network is always lacking. It's always missing something. A good example of this is when you hear neuroscience trying to explain love. Well, you can talk about all the neurons that fire and you can do all the mechanics of it, but it never does justice to what it is to be in love. Mm-hmm. And you kind of need poetry to do that, right? Or art. And this is one of the temptations that most of these discourses have, is they want to be the discourse that explains everything else and occupy this kind of master position. But again, just like we talked about earlier, the figure of the master is always lacking. They're always castrated. So is every field of discourse or area of study or whatever you want to call them. Basically, psychology can't answer everything. Science, biology can't answer everything. Christianity can't answer everything, and that's kind of the point of this. Is they wouldn't want psychoanalysis to be given this status, that because they're always trying to undermine this status as such. It's not that Freud actually does this. He just kind of, it's like he tiptoes in that direction of writing Thanatos and Eros into the fabric of the cosmos itself. I mean, it's almost like Taoism, right? Yin and yang and all that. And it's not that they're dismissing that. They're just saying this is not what psychoanalysis is cut out for. Okay. I think they would argue.
Okay, gotcha.
So, okay, here's some basic quotes just to support what I've said so far. So, I'm big on quotes. I like seeing these thinkers say this stuff for themselves. And so Freud says in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and this is a very good definition of pleasure, or pleasure principle. He says, the pleasure principle then is a tendency operating in the service of a function whose business it is to free the mental apparatus entirely from excitation, or to keep the amount of excitation in a constant, or to keep it as low as possible. So I've been saying that the whole time, but there it is in Freud's own words, right? It's all about maintaining a low level of excitation or getting rid of excitation. And obviously death drive goes in the other direction. So And then, as I said earlier, he acts like in this work that maybe death drive is primary. And again, we got to remember the mistranslation of the word trieb here. But he says the pleasure principle seems actually to serve the death instincts, death drives. And so that's an interesting thought. I mean,
in that they hold each other together, for, you know,
it's the idea that, you know, the pleasure principle had been primary for Freud for 20 years of his career, and it had held like the central position in his theory of libidinal economy. And he's saying, well, maybe the whole functioning of pleasure principle, which is to get excitation out of the body, actually is there just to serve the impulse of death drive. Like, death drive wants to keep on building up and intensifying excitation. So maybe pleasure principle's only purpose is to get excitation out of the body just so death drive can build it up again.
We interrupt this conversation for a quick message from our sponsors.
You may recognize this conversation from the past because it is actually a piece of a longer live stream. So what I've done is I've edited the conversations I had with Mikey down into smaller chunks, and I will be releasing those serially until the launch of the Slavoj Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do course, taught by Michael Downs and myself. I will be asking him the questions and hystericizing him, along with a cohort of people who will be joining us live and in the forums as we do a close reading of what Slavoj Žižek claims is his most important theoretical work, more important than Sublime Objective Ideology by far. He said that if you don't have anything to say about For They Know Not What They Do, then keep silent when it comes to Sublime Objective Ideology. But we don't just do close, thorough, hardcore readings. We also have some more introductory stuff. And so if you go to theory-underground.com/events, then you'll be able to see the dates of all of the upcoming events. You see that the Idea of University, taught by myself, Brian, and a couple of educators who are very close to me. And we wanted to focus on Karl Jasper's short work, The Idea of University, as a way to start the year, but it's also a way for Theory Underground to get off on the right track. January 25th is the Professional Managerial Class Consciousness course that I'm co-teaching with Elton LK of the Working Class Intelligentsia podcast. And then in February, on the 25th of February, launches Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do. Mikey has spent 2 decades getting himself to the point where he feels confident enough to teach this book. And I think that humility and effort that he's put in is something that we can all learn from. I mean, come on. He's like our own homegrown Žižek. He's like our own national treasure. I think that we really ought to uplift him and give credit where it's due, not just take him for granted and act like, you know, we don't need to. So that's a part of the reason actually why I really appreciate Brian Becker from Singularity Sublimity podcast. He's done a lot of amazing teaching work himself. A lot of people read the blog and then don't give credit where it's due. And that would be fine if he had a cushy academic career with tenure and all that. But he doesn't. He's working in a warehouse, supporting his mom. We need to hashtag free Mikey from wage labor so that he can spend more time doing what his passion is, which is teaching philosophy and theory, writing books. That's what we want. More of these kinds of conversations. Make it possible. Make a donation. 5, 15, 20, 50, 100. Make the donation today. Please. It means a lot. Words are cheap. Money, now that's where it matters. Get your skin in the game. Show Mikey you care. I hope that we'll get to do a lot more of this in the near future. And then the last thing, I'm doing a countrywide tour this year. I will be on the East Coast, I will be on the West Coast, and I will be everywhere in between. So if you want me to come to your town or city, email me. It's down below. If you want to volunteer, be a part of the street team, host, or guide while we're there, let me know. I hope to be in a city near you sometime this year, and I hope that you'll take one of my classes. Thanks.